Okay, so this talk has elements of various talks from earlier in the day, but it also kind of introduces a new, well, perhaps new element, which is trying to support women in music technology as well. So we'll see that as we go through. But I thought I'd just introduce myself first, because I've not been to this meeting before. So, yeah, as has just been said, I've got this kind of mixture of science and music in my upbringing. I was actually born into a musical family and did a lot of practical music making as a child. But my parents encouraged me to keep music as a hobby and do any other job. So I ended up doing physics at school because, well, after school I thought that would, help me understand the world and how everything worked. But I really missed the music, and after the first kind of change of direction, I ended up in music technology in Edinburgh, back in my hometown. And I worked with some great people kind of all through my projects. I've been really lucky to find people that are super interesting. And it's kind of directed my own work as I find my own path through these different topics. So I started looking a lot at sound art while I was in Edinburgh, and really trying to build installations as a way to keep music as a part of my life, but not be a performing musician. And when I was in The Hague, I continued this, but also introduced the idea of controlling these sound installations using an audio signal. So I was working a lot on sound analysis and trying to devise interactions that I could use to augment the sound in the room based on having a non-expert person producing sound live. And that worked quite well when I was in my own nicely controlled environment, but as always happens, you have to install an installation at a site, and I got kind of permanently frustrated by the changes that would arise in my interactions because of the changes in the acoustic space that I was in. But it seemed kind of illogical often, because my ear was managing fine in the new location, but there was something missing in my sound software. And this kind of thing is still the focus of what I'm working on. But it was what took me to Sheffield, to Speech and Hearing Group, where I'll talk a bit about the work I did there, but I was working on topics to do with perceptual constancy in audition. And that work kind of led directly into a number of postdocs there. So I've been based in the Speech and Hearing Group. There's kind of two strands going on there. There's one which, because it's a speech group, doing a lot of machine listening work to do with speech recognition, but going beyond standard ASR into kind of language learning support, either for second language learners, but also for people with hearing impairments, and also kind of medical computing more generally, so also working, like Duncan, with snore signals, and making assessments of people who are sleeping. So that was one project there. Also having quite ongoing work now with people with hearing impairment, and have moved to music psychology at Leeds University, where I'm working on a project to do with music listening through hearing aids. But the thing that was really missing in all of this work were the women in the field I was in. So I eventually kind of joined the bandwagon of trying to support women in music technology, and we have a group that's been meeting in Sheffield for 2.5 years now on a kind of monthly basis, and it's really with them that I've done the project that I want to talk about today. So I kind of introduce my two main collaborators in this. And Lucy on the far right is kind of well known now for her live coding in the region and beyond. And Deborah is running a venue in the centre of Sheffield, and she really kind of welcomed us in when we wanted to start this work. And I think a lot of the decisions that we've had to take along the way are really driven by very, very pragmatic needs and restraints of our practical personal lives, rather than the kind of research agendas that are driving a lot of the commercial and academic work that's on. So that's why I was saying there's maybe something a little bit different in what I show. So the network is really aiming to support each other with the skills that they have and to share these things in a less formal environment. So I developed this machine listening beginners workshop in music and kind of toured it around Yorkshire a little bit. So we gave it in university settings in Leeds and here in Huddersfield. And then it got kind of picked up. We were lucky enough to get a nice fund from Sheffield Hallam University to do quite a large range of events. We ran 8 kind of expert-led workshops, one of which kind of developed a little bit of this machine listening techniques, but really based in a community setting where the things we had to do were like provide computers for people, and most of I think there was a roughly half and half split between people who were coders and weren't. But that was then supported with these monthly socials, and we have a lot of makerspace sessions and peer learning that results there. And we've developed the work that I'm going to show through 2 main events there. There's a Connect the Dots festival where we really were working with community members to record audio, basically sharing the skills of actually making recordings and editing them and selecting the types of material you like to listen to. And then we submitted something for Algomec Festival, which is running in Sheffield for a few years now. And the theme of the festival that year was about unmaking. So this is the kind of the theme that we had in the back of our minds, was how do we do some unmaking, sharing our skills in the group. So because a lot of us amongst the larger group have childcare commitments and so on and so forth, we definitely were looking at the sound art side of things rather than the music performance side of things. It means people can come in and out, do things a bit more fluidly at their own pace and not necessarily have to rely on expensive things like babysitters and so on. So we were facing this question of how to introduce microphones into the sound art setting as well. And this is done quite regularly, obviously, in a musical setting, but far less regularly in an actual gallery setting. I mean, it does happen, but mostly when you see sound art involving microphones, it's kind of about listening, and there's a lot that goes on to do with topics of surveillance and audio forensics and all manner of other things. And in the cases where you do see microphones, they tend to be a feature of the art rather than a functional piece of equipment. So in an installation such as this, and in many others actually, the microphone is often not functioning in the sense of a microphone, but it might be generating sound rather than receiving it. So the way that we wanted to use microphones were in actually doing listening. And rather than thinking of it in a surveillance sense, we want it to be a nice, friendly activity where you're really a participant, that you're taking part. So it's kind of, instead of top-down, it's kind of a bottom-up approach. In terms of our kind of practical experience, we're dealing with what skills we have, so we're trying to get one step beyond speech recognition. And I think over the years, this field has kind of blossomed a lot. So we've gone from kind of simple vocabulary recognition, where we basically listen to the speech sounds themselves and throw out everything to do with the person. So the speech recognizer doesn't care if you're male or female or a child or which language you're speaking, really. It just deals with the actual acoustic part. So some of the kind of extensions are then to look at the emotion recognition, different content that's captured within the signal. Also looking at sort of triggering events with sound, so whether it's detecting something that happens. I mean, there's a lot of software gradually coming onto the market now to detect when an event happens, and maybe if alert a relative if you think someone's had a fall or this kind of event. And then there's the whole kind of music information retrieval world, where I think, again, like all the experiences that are shared today, we see the field is growing with more and more possible applications. But what it kind of comes down to, in a very practical sense of having a microphone in a gallery, is like choosing which part of the sound you're going to focus on. So it's a bit to do with having that task in mind of, okay, I'm going to listen to pitch, or I'm going to listen to the loudness and the duration and so on. What's my area of interest? And because of the way that our human systems work, we're always doing this in the context of what we have previously been doing. So it's not really that we can have some kind of calibrated setup that is going to respond the same as we are now, because as human beings, we're not really very well calibrated against each other or against our former selves or our future selves. So I think the starting point for this was really thinking of listening as an active process, and somehow finding an approach to deal with this idea of machine listening being very unreliable. And maybe it's kind of to some degree you can take care of that with the technology you have, whether it's microphones and speakers, removing other noise sources so you're in a quiet environment, and treating a room for reverberation and so on. But the usual kind of gallery install thing, and certainly this was the case for our Algomec festival, was just that you have to get in and quickly do it. We had something like an hour to set up. So I think this is quite standard for pop-up exhibitions, and different galleries take different approaches. So the obvious thing is to avoid producing sound in a room where you're hanging a microphone. That's one way to avoid it, and headphones are used all the time, well, not all the time, but very frequently for that result. Other exhibitions have done different things. At the bottom left here, there was the National Gallery exhibition, Soundscapes, I think 3 years ago maybe, where they just put one piece in each room, and that was a way to kind of almost isolate these pieces. A really interesting exhibition called Listening, which traveled around the Haywood exhibition. And that took a nice approach by kind of separating artworks in time as well as in space. So you'd have kind of choreographed activity. But I think what's kind of seen more often is a way to sidestep the kind of acoustic problem of sound in a room. So I can't quite see here, but on the left there's a spiral staircase which has contact microphones attached. So although you're using a microphone in this case for the signal, you're not really dealing with the room sound, you're just dealing with the vibration of the structure that's being activated. And what we're really looking to try and do is to get some of the expert knowledge that musicians have and use and put that into a kind of safe space that the general public can deal with somehow. And we're kind of wondering whether we can learn something about the way that we as humans adapt to the different room situation. And for us, like, the reverberation was the big unknown, because we were expecting people to come in and generate noise, so we were definitely going to be able to accommodate that. But what we couldn't tell was, how the room might affect the people or the sound that we were going to produce. So these are kind of like visual analogies for the parts of reverberation. We can think of it as being built up of a direct sound on the left, and the kind of early reflections which spectrally color the sound in the center, and then the late reverberation, which is kind of massive diffuse reflections on the right-hand side. And in terms of a kind of visual analogy, this central portion, the spectral coloration, we do have a kind of a way to deal with that, but you can, these internet sensations that flare up, so the black and blue dress that might have been white and gold, that was one that kind of flared up in that sense. And I think this kind of diffuse reverberation thing, we found an analogy that was a bit like this brightness illusion. So A and B, they're two squares, which here are actually the same color, even though they look like, when we understand them in the scene, they look the opposite shading pattern. And it's kind of about, well, this is something that our mind does to understand the whole scene that we don't yet do at a microphone when we're listening to sound with our self-generated software, let's say. But the kind of the late reverberation is the detrimental part in our perception. And the kind of the net effect of all those late diffuse reverberations is somewhat similar to an additive noise component in the signal. And the effect on the temporal envelope is that you have an increased noise floor and you have a reduced dynamic range, so that certain sounds, such as stop consonants, have these small gaps. Reflected sound fills in the gap, and Although to a human listener, that's not so bad because we have this period of adjustment and we can hear what's going on. But a machine listener that's trained on a clean signal will struggle to recognize that that dip has happened in a machine listener. So particularly these kind of rapid amplitude modulations are difficult to maintain under reverberant conditions. And the work that I did while I was in Sheffield really kind of looked at that a bit more detailed to assess how it is, or how quickly it is, that our human perception is able to accommodate for these different reverberation conditions that we hear. So to kind of cut a long story quite short, this is work which was done originally by Tony Watkins at Reading University, and then I replicated using real speech rather than the kind of synthetic stimuli that he had, but found very similar pattern of results, which is that it only takes around a second for us to adapt to reverberation. So if we hear a single word on its own reverberated with a mismatched context, our perception can be very easily tricked, actually, to mishear the word that's spoken with that mismatch. And usually what happens is that the stop consonants are missed. So the word stir might be heard as sir, also spur or skr. And through a series of kind of human listening experiments and modeling experiments, we found that this effect is very rapid to reintroduce the kind of robustness of our human perception. And it's not dependent on the fact that it's speech that's spoken. So it should be valid also for all types of musical sounds that we hear. In terms of our auditory systems, we talked a bit about this earlier. So there's the kind of the acoustic side on the left and the electrical side on the right. So we've got the sound coming in through the pinna, through the ear canal, through the bones and the cochlea up to the auditory nerve. And then if we skip over to the right-hand side, we can see the different stages of going up. But what's kind of important here is that there are all these downwards connections as well, the efferent links. And this is kind of vastly simplified because, for a start, it only shows one side of the auditory system and it doesn't show any of the other senses, how they overlap as well. But it's kind of just surprising there are a large number of downward connections, and we actually don't know very much yet about what they do, or when, or how. And what's more, the research that is done is usually not done in humans, because it's quite destructive. So we know that they're there, we know that they're working, but we don't know quite how and how fast. But what is clear is that there is this kind of continual recalibration of our senses to the environment that we're in, but also it's driven by attention, so it depends on the task that we're in, and probably many more things as well. However, it's possible to kind of begin this process of modeling it. So for my PhD, I was involved in kind of closing the loop of this efferent system. And I should have pointed out, it's a very huge simplification that we took. All of the downward arrows are simply kind of chucked into a black box, and we measure some acoustical aspect of the sound and use that to adapt the future behavior of that sound encoding. And essentially what we found was that this system, which is known to be activated in different animals under noisy conditions, also allowed us to replicate the effects of the late reverberation in our setup as well. So with some metric that's sensitive to the decaying tails of the reverberation, we were able to get a good model of our human listening experimental results. So how can we use that to improve our art installations? That's the kind of next step. And I think kind of going back to this idea from the music performance, I've adapted to Scipio's diagram to show the kind of the visitors entering the room, their sound being captured at the microphones. And really what we're kind of interested in is what type of audio to look at, what type of data to turn it into in order to generate more sound at the loudspeakers, that we can do this in a reliable way. And I think what kind of, like, what's very apparent to me is that Listening in this sense is very multidimensional. It's a kind of umbrella term for many different tasks, and it's really up to us to choose what we want to do. So for our festival exhibit, all to do with Unmaking, we decided to try to visualize sound, because part of the difficulty that visitors have, or that we all have talking about sound, is that we don't have the right vocabulary for it. So you can just about see here the microphone in the center, the speakers on either edge. There's a big screen up top, and then 3 others around about. And what this is allowing us to do is essentially do a bit of audio processing in the background, and then the large screen shows the input and output sound, allowing people to kind of have some intuitive response of what they're doing. And we split the vision into red, green, and blue to represent 3 different aspects of sound. And these 3 were, subject of quite some debate. We thought about different timbral spaces, and essentially we didn't want to limit ourselves to the speech sounds. We didn't really have much in common between our musical interests, between us all, except for a sense of play, and we were all interested in this idea of play. And obviously we needed to be like within the kind of realms of what we could hear ourselves to detect the sound. So thinking about these timbral aspects, we realized it's actually a little bit more refined. We're still at a quite crude level of our analysis before that. So rather than equalizing loudness, duration, pitch, and the reverberation direction, rather than kind of do that, we said, well, that's actually our raw material. So in the end, we set up a set of prompts which would allow people to pick apart these different aspects of loudness, pitch, and noise in the signal, and we assigned each of them to a screen. So the red is a kind of, it's the amplitude, it's the recording light, it's the first kind of thing you do as you make noise. Then that might be a pitched noise, and we have a couple of swanny whistles and things that allow you to explore that. Or it might be less pitched noise, and there's kind of rattles and shakers and things that allow that as well. And then really what we tried to do was figure out ways to draw in some kind of simplified aspects of this biological processing to try to make our assessments of loudness, pitch, and noise adapt to the state of the room as it transpired during the installation. So part of that was about moving the numerical ranges of the values as, say, there was a cafe over, when its fridge is kicked on and the kind of background level would rise, then the sensitivity of our noise detector would have to amend so that we were not solely reacting to those non-visitored aspects. But in addition to the kind of environmental stuff, we obviously had to maintain a good range for visitors and be aware to back out as well, so that the invigilators didn't have to listen to everything all the time. So just as kind of next steps for the project now, I've got a kind of long-standing survey open. A few of you might have seen this before, but if you are involved in kind of live sound or indeed sound art that involves microphones, I would really love it if you fill in this survey and leave me your email. You don't have to, but then we can talk some more. And just to say, this group that I'm working with, SONA, we got a nice fund to do some more events this year. So we're inviting 6 women to Sheffield to do some concerts, but alongside that we're developing another installation as well. So if you have ideas for interaction strategies that you would like to discuss, then please come talk to us. And they're open to everyone. It's not just for women, these events, so if you're in Sheffield, please come. That's it.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Amy. That was a very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Any questions, please? Got time for 2, I think. Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. It's a really interesting, different way of looking at acoustics and sound and how we can analyse it, particularly for the public. Could you give us some idea of how the public did respond to that exhibition with looking at the noise
Yeah.
the pitch and loudness?
Yeah, loudness. So everybody got the loudness. That was quite intuitive. The visual feedback really helped, but there was also an auditory layer that came in immediately. So we kind of set a very, very low-level frame, bottom rumbly frequencies and top high-end stuff that literally set the frame for the event. But loudness would generate something very obvious that accompanied you. So it was like a one-to-one kind of, oh, I'm doing something, they're doing it too, kind of, yeah. Okay. Pitch was much harder, but that was kind of, I think we made it harder than it had to be. We decided to only react to pitches within a certain range, and we chose to limit ourselves to the range in which male, female, and children's voices all overlap. And we found a couple of toys that more or less accessed that. But it meant that if somebody kind of brought out their phone, as we weren't we weren't really anticipating this, but a lot of people produced sound-making devices, probably because it was part of a kind of sound festival. So, and when they were outside the range of this, the device would stop reacting. So that was a case where we should have pushed the edges much further and allowed that kind of sensitivity to adapt as well, but that's maybe something to try this time. And the noisiness was much harder for people to kind of grasp until we pointed it out. But the visual response was different from the sound response. So again, this was us just experimenting and trying things out really, but we made the visual response, it's basically, because there was quite a bit of background noise in the space, it would show, and then whenever you played something pitched, it would go to black. Then it would come back blue again whenever you stopped. But we didn't want to be producing audio noise all the time. So we put that on a change detector rather than a kind of on-off thing. So whenever you began making noise or stopped making noise, it gave you a sort of little, like, keys jingling or whatever. And actually, I didn't really say that, but the actual audio which was activated in the space was not the live sound of the visitors. It was actually the stuff that had been recorded by the community members in the previous instance of our kind of collecting thing, this Connect the Dots festival. So that was our way of preventing live audio feedback. Yeah.
Great. Time for one more quick question. Okay, no, if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank Amy again.
Thank you.